Welcome into another edition of the Stingers Up Sacramento State Football Podcast. I'm Jason Ross. Hopefully you had a wonderful holiday, Thanksgiving, stuffed yourself, and you're recouped and ready to go for the second season. That's what Troy Taylor and the coaching staff has called it. That first one was perfect. As you know, 11-0, 2-seed. Playoffs begin for the Hornets this Saturday, and we've got a lot to cover here today on the podcast. We thank you for all of you that have supported us throughout the season, and if you're new here, thank you. Let everyone know that we're around, and we're going to be talking about this great football program that has dreams and aspirations of a long playoff run, but it starts with one, and they got to see if they can get the first one. It's been eluding them in the past, and this weekend we now know who the Sacramento State Hornets are going to play, as the layout was either Davidson or Richmond. Richmond hosted Davidson last weekend, and to Richmond's credit, it wasn't much of a contest. 41-0, Reese Udinsky, and the offense, amazing. The defense pitched the shutout. The Hornets were preparing for both teams. Now, of course, they've locked in on just the one, as the Richmond Spiders are coming out to California for their first ever trip in round two, as we're now to the Sweet 16 of the FCS playoffs. So today on the podcast, we are going to look at the brackets and how things have laid out for some Big Sky teams and just the overall selection process with Sam Herder. And if you follow FCS playoffs or FCS at all, Sam does a great job for Hero Sports. Certainly is a must-follow on Twitter to see his articles and opinions and kind of constant commentary on what's going on in the FCS, Hornets included, Big Sky included. And we're going to get a preview of this Saturday's game as the Richmond Spiders come to town, as we mentioned. Bob Black, their longtime voice, will join us as well. So let's get going because there's a lot for us to cover. And we start with our conversation with Sam Herder. All right, as we mentioned, got to catch up more on just the overall landscape of the FCS and the playoffs. And if you're not following Sam Herder on Twitter or at Hero Sports or different things that he does, you're missing out because he covers this level with thoroughness, good objectiveness, knows all the things inside and out as Sam Herder joins us on the Stingers Up Football Podcast. Sam, how are you?
I'm doing great. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, thank you. Is this like, we're coming up on the holidays and Christmas, I guess. Is this like Christmas for you when we get to the FCS playoffs?
It really is. I know there's some flaws and some warts in the FCS playoff system, which have certainly been exposed this year. But overall, when you have a 24-team bracket to decide a Division I football national champion, it's really special and unique that the FCS has. And so there are some negatives to it. Maybe we'll talk about that. Maybe we won't, but I know that's kind of the Twitter conversation right now. But when it comes down to it, the teams on the field, who's going to go to the quarterfinals, who's going to go to the semifinals, the 3-week break between the FCS championship game that, causes a lot of excitement on social media. This whole next month from late November to early January is a really fun time in the FCS.
Yeah, well, I'll get into some of I am curious about your opinion on some of those flaws. I'll go back first to the actual selection process and the 24 they put in. Help me understand as a Hornet, and certainly I could be looking at this through Sacramento State glasses, but, they have a great conference. They go undefeated, the only one, and this is not to indict South Dakota State by any means or North Dakota State or anybody else, but I don't know what else the Hornets could have done to be number one. Now they're two. There's no shame in being two by any means, but what do you think the thought process was for the committee to have them at two as opposed to one?
Yeah, that is one sign of maybe some of the inconsistencies this year where, Montana was the last team in, and one of the reasons was they play in a really good conference. But on the flip side, Sac State plays in a really good conference, and they went undefeated, and it had a pretty tough path, too, playing some of those ranked teams. Then, Sac State going undefeated with an FBS win, beating all those Big Sky teams. You could make an argument that they should have been the top seed. And in my final bracket projection, I did have Sac State as the number 1 seed, South Dakota State the number 2 seed. My reasoning for that is usually in the past, the playoffs committee would take more of a objective approach and just look at resumes. And Sac State had by a slim margin, Sac State probably had a better resume than South Dakota State. More wins, an FBS win, a slightly stronger strength of schedule. Didn't lose a game either. More ranked wins as well. And so, I did think that Sac State deserved it, but the playoff committee took more of a subjective approach and just said, who do we think is the better team? Who do we think would win on a neutral field? And It appears more of them than not felt that South Dakota State was just a straight up better team than Sac State, even though the resume might, say otherwise. So it was more of a subjective thing than an objective approach to the top two seeds there.
And just another observation for me on that. I mean, again, it's kind of, nitpicking here to have the Hornets at 2 compared to 1. It's not, in the end, I don't know that it's going to have a great impact. Who knows? We'll see how the playoffs go. But I found it interesting that I honestly thought then Montana State would be 3 and North Dakota State would be 4, even with what North Dakota State has done in their incredible history. Do you think any of that was done with a purpose of, hey, let's keep the Big Sky away from each other, let's keep the Missouri Valley away from each other, so they potentially could get a South Dakota State, North Dakota State final, or for that matter, a Sacramento State and Montana State final?
Yeah, it's not supposed to work that way. The seeding process is through individual voting, and so the playoff committee will talk about, here's this team's resume, here's that team's resume. This team, potentially could be an 8 seed, or these 3 teams are vying for the top 2 seeds. These 5 teams are vying for the top 4 seeds, and they kind of talk about it and talk about each team. But when it comes to actually ordering the seeds, they each individually vote on the computer, this is my number 1 seed, this is my number 2 seed, on and on and on, and then that forms. Through whatever system the NCAA has, that forms the seeds 1 through whatever, and then they talk about that again. Should this team really be that seed? Should that team really be that seed? And then they all individually vote again, and then that second vote, whatever, they do a point system, and then that's the order. And so it's not necessarily something where they all go, well, we have South Dakota State the 1 seed. We have to put North Dakota State the 3 seed. We shouldn't put them the 4 seed, because then you could have an all Big Sky semifinal, all Valley semifinal. They don't necessarily talk about that as a group thinking to order it that way, but each individual committee member could think that way and vote their seeds, how they see fit with South Dakota State and North Dakota State on opposite sides, and Montana State and Sac State on opposite sides. And so they aren't supposed to look ahead when it comes to the seed order as far as potential matchups down the road. They're just supposed to say, this is who I think should be 1, 2, all the way down to 8. That's how they should do it. But you never know. There could be some thought process in the back of the minds of, okay, these are our top 4 seeds from 2 conferences. Let's separate them on opposite sides.
As far as the overall 24, let's go to the kind of the flaws you were hinting at and others have been talking about on social media, specifically maybe the last weekend where whether it's hosting, getting bids, regionalizing some of this. Is that where the FCS can maybe make some improvements in the future?
I think so. Now it's kind of a balance of things, because the FCS playoffs is not a huge moneymaker. It doesn't drive big revenue. Now that could potentially change in August of 2024 when a new media deal is out there. This current one is pretty bad, honestly, as far as what ESPN pays the NCAA to broadcast all of these postseason tournaments, including the FCS and the women's basketball tournament, baseball, softball. There is a push to the women's basketball tournament will certainly be sold separately. That's worth way more than what they're paying now. There's hope that the FCS playoffs could be sold separately, but even if it's not, the NCAA should get a lot more money when it comes to the broadcast deal, and that could help some of this. But at the end of the day, the FCS not a huge TV market thing, not huge crowds, and so there isn't a ton of revenue being generated. And so what the NCAA does is they only seed 8. They regionalize the bracket. If there's a game between 2 unseeded teams, they usually go to the bid amount, not all the time like North Dakota and Weber states, but most of the time they go to bid amounts, and they also eat a good chunk of the ticket revenue. And for them to do that, that basically makes up for the travel costs, because they do fly these teams, they do bus these teams, and they do cover those type of costs. And so when they do that, the FCS is one of the rare postseason tournaments outside of the basketball tournaments that either generates the NCAA a little bit of money, or they at least break even on it. And so could there be some changes? I think so. I think they could seed 1 through 16, where the 1 through 8 seeds still get a bye. 9 through 16 teams, they get a guaranteed home playoff game, but they still have to bid a flat amount. Maybe they have to pay $50,000 to bid instead of this, closed envelope, who bid more, and then they get matched up with teams 17 through 24. Less based about the seeds and more based about regionality. Let's say next year Weber State is the number 13 seed and Montana is outside of the top 16 seeds based on the regionality. Maybe they send Montana to Weber State. And so that could help a lot of this subjectiveness and kind of lack of transparency and lack of consistency by doing it this way, while still also having a regional aspect to it and still also having some level of bids to help the bottom line of the NCAA. I do think that is something the commissioners and the ADs should push, and I have had some tell me that is something we do want to push, but it's just a matter of the multiple committees they need to go through for approval for this to happen.
Yeah, and keeping it regionalized, I think about this weekend, round 2. Man, Weber State, I thought could have been a seeded team. Instead, they had to play last weekend in the snow. They beat North Dakota. And their reward, they have to go to Montana State. Man, you're cannibalizing yourself if you're the Big Sky, but that feels like a matchup that should be in a later round as opposed to this weekend.
Yeah, it really is. And, it's one of those things where Montana State, certainly should be mad about being seeded behind North Dakota State, and they should be mad about this draw they have in the second round. Although even if Montana State was the 5 seed, the 4 seed, or the 3 seed, that they still probably would have gotten this draw just based off of regionalization. But yeah, when Weber State, which was essentially awarded the home playoff game versus UND because of their performance and because of Weber State was just getting left out of the seeds, they're probably the quote unquote number 9 seed in this bracket. But for them to be sent to number 4 seed Montana State in a rematch, like you said, these are two teams that probably could both make a run to the semifinals. Most likely in that portion of the bracket, William & Mary will beat Gardner-Webb. And I think William & Mary going to Montana State in the quarterfinals, that should be a Montana State win. William & Mary is solid, but, not an elite program. And I think if Weber State wins this weekend, they could go across the country and beat William & Mary on the road. And so I think whoever wins this game has, a pretty good shot to make it to the semifinals. And so it is unfortunate that these two teams meet this early. But, again, it's kind of just reality, and we see it a lot. There was a lot of South Dakota State, North Dakota State second-round matchups earlier in the 2010s. And so it's kind of, hopefully it's something like this, can change in the future. But, these regionalized matchups, we're kind of used to them by now.
Sam, I want to ask you about the Hornets. Here they are as the 2 seed. We addressed that earlier. And I don't know a ton about the CAA, but they got a couple of 5 teams in. They had good success last week, including Richmond taking care of Davidson. A blowout, 41-0. What do you think about this matchup? What should Hornet fans expect from this Richmond Spider team?
Yeah, it's solid. It's a solid Richmond team. They've made huge improvements over the last couple of years. The defense has always been solid over the last few years, still is solid this year. The problem with them recently has been their offense, but they brought in 2 transfers, quarterback Reese Udinsky and wide receiver Jacob Harris, 2 All-American level guys that played FCS football at VMI, and that's really taken their offense to another level. They spread the ball out, they get the ball out of their hands quick, kind of a high-flying passing attack. And so, for Sac State, I think you have to get after the offensive line, get after the quarterback, make them a little uncomfortable and out of rhythm, but it's also, a big day for, sound fundamental tackling. These guys, Richmond, they get the ball to their athletes in space. They try to make a guy miss and, turn a 3-yard gain into a 15-yard gain, and they just, kind of go quick. And so got to tackle well in the open field to limit those big plays. But this is, it's a fun matchup because Richmond is not necessarily a blue blood, but they have had national success in the past. They made it to the semifinals in 2015. When you think of the CAA, who's more of a power league in the FCS, some of the first teams you think of are probably Richmond, New Hampshire, Villanova, teams like that. And so it is a well-known FCS team as far as just, brand, I guess, for lack of a better word. So this is a good test for Sac State. And, we don't usually see Big Sky versus CAA games this early in the bracket. So it's an exciting matchup from a national viewpoint.
I know you've written about Sac State and kind of the narrative that's out there, and some of it's been fair. I mean, the Hornets, the demon that's out there is that they've not won a playoff game, but they've checked the other boxes as far as quality of opponents, who they've been able to beat, the consistency that they've done it in the regular season. Fans have shown up, all those things. Now's the next battle, and they've had 2 awful post-game performances. The one a couple years ago against Austin Peay was honestly, I call it their game, Sam, and I just under Troy Taylor, that was their worst game they've played. And then last year, South Dakota State was really a tough draw, got behind, and it felt like if that game had a few more minutes, I think they get them, but it didn't. That was the reality of it. So I don't know what they're feeling internally, but what's kind of that national thought about Sac State, that this program has really grown, it's doing something, but do they finally have to do something in the postseason to really get that validation?
Yeah, I think having success in the playoffs is key, and to take that next step. And this kind of brings me back to two things I wrote. One more recently is, and you touched on it, there's been some narratives about Sac State, and three that come to mind, and two of them I think they've already overcome. That one is that they haven't beaten anyone in the Big Sky. While that was already a pretty bad narrative coming into this year because they had beaten some good teams, the number of ranked teams that Sac State beat this year in the Big Sky was really impressive. The other narrative is, no one goes to the games. Well, Sac State is like number 11 in FCS attendance, drawing 15,000 fans, and so that's another weird narrative I don't get. But there is that third narrative of, they can't get it done in the playoffs. It doesn't matter what they do in the regular season as long as they're not winning in the playoffs. It doesn't really matter, and that kind of brings me back to my preseason preview article about Sac State, where I said Sac State and Troy Taylor, and really good coaching staff, really good talent. They have definitely gotten a ton of respect around the FCS. Those who cover the FCS know what Sac State was, 5 years ago compared to what they are now. And there's a lot of respect for the improvements they've made, but it's no longer a feel-good story of, look at the progress this program has done. Now it's, okay, now we need to see it on a national scale. We need to see you make a run to the quarterfinals, the semifinals, possibly beyond, to turn that corner of, this is a feel-good story. They turn things around to, this is truly a national powerhouse. And so, they kind of faced that doubt all throughout this year, even though they had an undefeated record, a great resume. They're still in the back of everyone's mind saying, but we need to see it in the playoffs first. And Sac State is always going to face that doubt until they erase that doubt. And I think they are built much better this year to erase that doubt of not being able to do anything in the playoffs, just playing better defense, more physical on offense. I think they are better built now to win multiple games in the playoffs and kind of get that last narrative about them, out of the mouths of people that follow the FCS.
And with that said, as I know you wrote, and you kind of had a ranking of the 16 that were left on the best chances to win it all, and you obviously thought pretty highly of the Hornets. I think you had them third. So, I mean, they're ranked second. You think they've got about the third best chance to win this whole thing. I mean, that's the company they're in. It's really nice to see this program do that, but they got to start breaking through. If you look at just ahead, I know the coaches and the players need to lock in on Richmond, but if you do look ahead in their region, besides the obvious of Richmond being this weekend, what other landmines should Hornet fans be concerned about?
Yeah, it is a pretty challenging path to Frisco in the national championship game for Sac State. You look at the number one seed, South Dakota State. They play Delaware, who's solid, but they should win. And then after this round, in the quarterfinals, Holy Cross, New Hampshire shouldn't really present any problems. And then in the semifinals, potential game against Weber State or Montana State, still feel pretty good about the Jacks winning there. On the flip side, for the number two seed, Sac State, Richmond, we talked about them. They're a quality opponent, but still should be, Sac State will be favored to win. And then in the quarterfinals, UIW is one of the highest octane offenses in the FCS. They could lose to Furman, and I do think Furman is a really balanced team, and so that quarterfinal game is going to be a challenge. I do think Furman is built really well defensively, so maybe they could slow UIW down. Plus UIW is dealing with their head coach being rumored to be a candidate for some FBS head coach openings, and so something to keep an eye on there for UIW. But again, Sac State should be favored to beat Furman or UIW if they play their game in the quarterfinals. But then in the semifinals is kind of where I hesitate a little bit. I have South Dakota State, my number one favorite to win the national title. I have NDSU number 2 and Sac State number 3. I can obviously flip my mind if NDSU is kind of struggling but still winning, but not by much, and Sac State is dominating. I might flip my mind for that potential semifinal matchup. But right now it's probably based on past precedent more than anything. And I understand that's not fair, but at the same time, NDSU didn't look all that great last year during the regular season. They looked good, but not dominant. And then they rolled through the playoffs for the most part and dominated Montana State. And so maybe it's deja vu more than anything, where it's like, can a Big Sky team really beat North Dakota State? I think there are some out there that can, but at the same time, until I actually see it happen, I just always kind of lean toward NDSU peaking in December and starting to roll toward the national title game. And so that's why I have NDSU one spot ahead of Sac State as far as my power rankings to win the national title.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair. I mean, the Hornets obviously have to prove it. They're on the big stage again, and anxious to see what they do on Saturday. Sam, it's so great to catch up with you for a few moments. We encourage everybody to check you out and all your work, certainly on Twitter at Sam Herder FCS, but all your stuff you do at Hero Sports, all things FCS that you cover. You do great work, and I hope the Hornets have a long playoff run because that might mean we might see you down the line. But again, Sam, thank you so much for joining us, and we'd love to do this again sometime soon.
Yeah, that sounds great with me. I appreciate you, again, having me on.
All right, thank you to Sam. Again, make sure you follow Sam Herder and all the info and details that he provides. As far as this weekend goes, the opponent, it's the Richmond Spiders as they are here, and looking forward to the matchup. We got a chance to catch up with their longtime voice, Bob Black. All right, as we said, we got to get a preview of the opponent this week for Sacramento State. You look at the brackets, you see when everything comes out, you're so excited about Sacramento State, but there's going to be someone in front of them. We didn't know, would it be Davidson? Would it be Richmond? We now know after watching last week, and it's the Richmond Spiders who advance, and advance easily. They looked great last week with a 41-0 shutout, and their voice, longtime voice of the Richmond Spiders, Bob Black, joining us here. Bob, how are you?
Jason, doing great. Happy to still be talking FCS football in late November and into December. I can tell you that. It's been a while for the Spiders.
Yeah, but you've had success in the past, a championship years back, and it's been a while. But, I mean, isn't this – I mean, obviously all this for you and I, it's fun to call any game, but it's more fun now, right? Isn't it?
Yeah, I'm happy to report it's still as much fun for us as it was for those of us that were here a half dozen years ago, the last time the Spiders made the playoffs, and certainly dating back, as you alluded to 2008 when we won the national championship, and just, what a memorable experience that was. But it's really intriguing and interesting to watch our guys, most of whom have not been in the postseason. There's a sprinkling of players that were at other schools that have been in the FCS playoffs, but for the majority of this team, they're going through it for the first time.
Well, I got to ask you about 2008 there, just because, and pardon the ignorance, the Hornets weren't sniffing the playoffs, weren't even remotely close back then. So when you guys, not when you won it, but when you were entering the postseason, did it feel like, hey, this is a championship team?
Yeah, I think it really did, and I think the year before really helped. We had advanced to the semifinals, and the big dog back then was Appalachian State, which is obviously now an FBS team and doing very well in the Sun Belt Conference. And we had lost the year before to App State in the semifinals at App State, and we got a rematch with them in 2008. And I think that really helped because most of that team returned from the 2007 team. So as that playoff unfolded, I think they felt better and better about themselves. They were excited about getting a rematch with App State, and that would have been in the quarterfinals. And then in the semifinals, they beat Northern Iowa, which has been another staple of the FCS playoffs, and beat them at Northern Iowa in their dome stadium. And then the championship game, I think there was so much confidence. Not that it was a foregone conclusion that Richmond was going to win, but I think after having beaten App State and Northern Iowa, they felt pretty good. It was Montana, which was, obviously it still is a great program, but they dominated that championship game, which back then was in Chattanooga, and won it 24-7. It was really never in doubt. So it was a memorable run in 08 for the Spiders. Probably, other than me, the only other person that was a part of that is our head coach, Russ Huseman, who was our defensive coordinator in 2008. And I don't want to be too long-winded with you, Jason, but the remarkable part of that story was as soon as that game ended, he stayed in Chattanooga, which was his alma mater, and he took the head coaching job at Chattanooga the very next day. He didn't even come back on the airplane to Richmond with us to celebrate. He stayed at Chattanooga. They hired him the very next day as Chattanooga's head coach.
Well, now he's back. You're still there. What did it feel like, Bob, when this season started? What was your read on the Spiders? Did you see this as a team that would go 8-3 and do some damage in the CAA?
Yeah, I think the hope was definitely there, Jason. I think everybody from Coach Huseman all the way through the program and the organization knew it was time to get back to the postseason. There have been a couple of near misses since Coach Huseman's been the head coach, but he hadn't been able to get over that hump and get us there, and he had proven that he can do it because he did it 3 times at Chattanooga while he was at his alma mater. So I think they were all very focused on this year being that season. They went a little bit into the transfer portal, which Richmond doesn't do a whole lot of. They are very selective when they do that, and they brought in, obviously, a standout quarterback in Reese Udinsky and a standout wide receiver in Jacob Harris and an offensive coordinator in Billy Kosh. And the common thread between all three of them was that all of them had, at one time or another and together, been at VMI. And that's a program that hasn't had a lot of success, but they had when those three guys were there. They broke through and got to the postseason. So they were very successful there. And to cobble all three of them together and bring them here gave us great hope that this would be a season that it's turned out to be.
It makes sense to me that those three would have some great continuity, but pairing that with what was already there, was that seemingly seamless, I guess?
Yeah, it's almost like you're listening to our conversation because we just did our podcast with Reese Udinsky was our player guest on this one, and he talked about that because I think there was a thought when he came in that it would be a lot of Reese Udinsky to Jacob Harris, right? They've been together for 3 years, that he'd have 150 completions between the two of them, and it hasn't turned out that way. As it's turned out, Reese has really spread the wealth, and 3 of the top 4 receivers in the Colonial Athletic Association were his guys. So it wasn't just Jacob Harris, it was Leroy Henley, and it was Josiah Williams, and even Nick DeGennaro, who's the 4th wide receiver, has a basket full of catches to his credit as well. So it wasn't just that combination. Certainly they brought experience and successful experience with them from VMI, but Reese and Coach Kosh with that offense done a tremendous job of spreading the ball around.
One of the interesting stats, I think, to watch on Saturday, I can't remember the exact number, but I want to say, Bob, it's 14 straight games that Sacramento State's defense has held the opposing quarterback to under 60% completion, which is significant. That helps them in their chance to win games. If they're able to do that this week, I mean, with what Reese Udinsky is doing, I mean, obviously the quarterback's goal is to go back, throw, and complete passes, but he's doing this at such a high clip. What do you credit that incredible success rate to for that offense?
When he came in, the scouting report on him from Coach Kosh and from Coach Huseman, who obviously did a lot of study of Reese before bringing him in, that A, he's very intelligent, he doesn't make very many mental mistakes, and B, he's very accurate. Wherever he's throwing the ball on the field, it's going to go to his receiver or it's not going to anybody. So when there's an incompletion or even an interception, and there are only 4 of those all year, it's a total shock to everybody. But I do think it's his acumen, his sense for the game, number one, mentally and then physically. He has a really, not that he's not a strong-armed kid, because he is, he's a big kid, but he's extremely accurate. He can put the ball in tight windows, and more often than not, he'll put it where either his guy's going to catch it or it's going to be an incompletion, and they'll live to play another down.
Offense, as you know, goes as much as that offensive line. How's the O-line as you prep for this playoff game?
Yeah, in pretty good shape, and that was another key that Coach Huseman really harped on the preseason, is this is about as deep as we have been with our offensive line since he has been here. Now, they did lose one player right before the season opener against Virginia that would have made them even deeper, but they were able to rebound from that pretty successfully. And other than that young man at a tackle position, they've been pretty healthy most of the year. There have been the usual nicks and knacks and that sort of thing. But really the starters who have been there most of the season, and even the backup 2 or 3 guys that they put in that rotation, they're all in pretty good shape going into this week's game.
How about the defense collectively? Obviously, you got to have a ton of confidence coming off a shutout with Davidson, and it's just a unique offense for you guys to completely bottle them up. They've got to be ultra confident. But what do you think about the defense coming into this playoff game?
Well, they'll have unique again to deal with this week with 2 quarterbacks going in and out. So that's even more a challenge, I think, this week than that option was last week. I think that's how they're approaching it as well. The really fascinating story, Jason, on Richmond's defense this year has been the defensive line. That was the question mark coming into the season. We lost a couple of guys, defensive ends, to graduation, a defensive tackle who transferred to Wake Forest and is starting now for the Demon Deacons. And then again, right before the season started, lost a young man to a season-ending Achilles injury. So the depth on the defensive line was suspect. And it's been really fun to watch them come of age, the way they've been coached up, the way they have gotten better. The 2 defensive ends are both all-conference performers, Marlon Lewis and Jeremiah Grant. And the veteran defensive tackle, Ray Eldridge, was a third-team All-CAA selection as well. The intriguing story is the other defensive tackle position, Carson Stoklinski. Remember the name? He was an offensive lineman when summer camp began, and because they were so thin on defense, he kind of raised his hand and said, "Coach, I played defensive line at high school. If you want me to move over, I will." And not only did he move over, but he's been the starting defensive tackle since week 1 of the season against Virginia. So the defensive line has really come of age. The linebackers have been good for several years together. Philip O'Connor, Tristan Wheeler, and Xavier Marshall. And then the secondary is also probably about as good as Coach Huseman has had since he's been here.
Wow. As far as the other elements, special teams, kicking, punting, coverages, how do the Spiders stack up there?
So kicking, I wouldn't say has been an adventure, but it has been different. We have used 2 kickers. Jake Larson was the incumbent at that position and opened the season as our kicker. He actually injured a hamstring running a play in practice about 4 games into the season. He had just had a bad miss against Elon in our loss to Elon. He had an opportunity to win the game with a 42-yard field goal on the last play and missed that, and then he hurt his leg. So he's a little bit down in the dumps. Andrew Lopez took over as our kicker, really hadn't kicked for us up until that point. He'd been the understudy to Jake Larson, and he's nailed almost everything. I think he's missed 1 field goal and 1 PAT the rest of the way. And now Larson is healthy again, and the coaching staff is kind of using Jake Larson as their long field goal kicker and Andrew Lopez as their shorter field goal kicker. And just as a story of redemption for Jake Larson, he came back and kicked the game-winning field goal, 39-yarder at Delaware that gave us our 8th win and clinched a postseason spot. So that's been a fun position to watch. And then we have an Australian, as I believe you guys do as well, at the punting position in Aaron Trussler. So maybe the 2 of them will be able to commiserate before the game and talk about the good old times back home. And he's been terrific for us. His net punting average has been really good.
As we look at the Spiders, as you look at them, let's take a positive and a negative. So when things are going right, what are you looking at, and maybe what are some of their trouble spots if they've gotten in some of their losses this season?
Well, I would say, and much like Sacramento State, they're going to run tempo offense. So when they get in a rhythm, they are really good, and they'll get up on the ball and they'll move it as quickly as they possibly can. And I think that's when this offense is at its best. I think when they have to slow down, when there's a couple of incompletions or they get behind the sticks, I think that becomes a little bit more of an issue. They have not thrown the deep ball a whole lot. I'm sure Reese Udinsky can do it, and we've got a couple of receivers who have good speed, but for the most part, they have not thrown the deep ball a lot in any game. So I would say the weakness, and I know a lot of offenses can say the same thing, is getting behind the sticks. If you get them in 2nd and 13 or, even 2nd and 9 or 10, they're not quite as comfortable as if they pick up positive yardage on first down.
I think one of the charms of this game is the fact that, Big Sky, CAA, both conferences are good, both got a lot of playoff representation, but I'm trying to figure out how they match up. I mean, I see stats, but there's not a lot of common threads amongst these leagues, and that makes this fun. I mean, there's uncertainty. The Hornets, I would say, would come in as the favorite. Doesn't mean Richmond can't win. This makes this weekend in the playoffs just so much fun to me.
Yeah, that is exactly what it's all about, and the fun that it is to not know that much about an opponent, and in our case, to go somewhere where we've never been. This will be the first football game that the University of Richmond has ever played in the state of California at any level, back from when they started in 1898 or whatever it was. So this is the first trip to California. So I love that, like you just said. I love the idea that you're playing new teams, you're going to new places, you're putting together new game plans. I think that energizes everybody. Obviously, you want to win a championship, and it's one and done at this point, but I do think you get energized by the idea that you're going to match up against somebody from another conference that we talk about on a regular basis, and just how good the Big Sky is and the teams in the conference that are so good, but you don't really drill down on them during the regular season because you're not going to play them. Well, now they're drilling about as deep as they possibly can to find out about Sacramento State and to find out about Richmond.
And I know we were talking before we started this interview that, granted, you're coming all the way across country, but sounds like Coach and the staff agreed to leave on a Thursday, get maybe an extra day acclimated. Is that kind of the thought behind getting out here a day earlier?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. My partner on our radio and TV broadcasts, Chris Anderson, played for us in the late 1990s and on a playoff team as well. And he was chuckling and said, I remember back when we were in the playoffs, we were still driving from Richmond to Washington, D.C. and getting on a commercial plane in Washington, D.C. and flying, wherever. So these guys, they've got it good. We're going to get on a charter plane because the NCAA now provides that. We're going to get on a charter plane on Thursday evening, our time, and fly out to Sacramento and, be there early evening, something like that on Thursday, and then have the full day Friday to try and get acclimated, with the area, with the time change, with the change in schedule, all of that. I do think there's an advantage to being the home team at this point in the postseason. So they're going to do, everything they can to put their guys in a comfort zone and be in as good a shape to play the game on Saturday afternoon at 2:00 your time out there.
Yeah, well, these two teams deserve it. They've both had great years. It's going to be fun. The intensity, the excitement. Bob, we really appreciate your time. Look forward to meeting you in person on the weekend, and thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Enjoyed it and look forward to seeing you out there this weekend, Jason.
Well, as I give my thoughts on Saturday, I'm going to maintain with a lot of things that I've said about the Hornets all year long. It's, can they get this game in their terms? And what are the Hornet terms? If you've watched them and followed them or listened to us on the radio, you know what their terms are. Run the ball, take care of the ball, limit mistakes, and get ahead. If they get ahead, this team is so absolutely lethal. And looking back at playoff failures the last two times, to Austin Peay and last year to South Dakota State, the Hornets were down 28-0 and 24-0. In any other game in the history of Troy Taylor as coach at Sacramento State, that hasn't happened. So those feel like outliers, but the Hornets also have to figure out why. Why have they had those slow starts in the postseason? Certainly there's another team that's responsible for it, but what have they done to cause some of those deficits? So I think the Hornets have to do some evaluation to see why those have happened and now realize they've got to change that for this weekend's matchup against Richmond. It should be a fun game. There's a lot of anticipation. The Hornets can't put any more pressure on it. Play their game. If they do that and they play hard, play smart, I like their chances. Doesn't mean it's automatic. Obviously, like I said earlier, you got another team on the other side. Richmond's very good, very talented, a team that doesn't make a lot of mistakes. They're on the positive side on the turnover ratio. They've got a good offense, a good defense. It's a school with a good tradition. So it's just understanding the CAA versus the Big Sky, matchup versus matchup. And, we'll see about the weather. It looks like some rain. We'll see. I mean, the Hornets have to go out there and do their thing. And if they play to their seed, what the decision makers thought, the Hornets are favored, and this is a game, and you're at home, you can't have a better path than Sacramento State has. Now, they got to go out and do it. So we look forward to it. Again, our thanks to Sam Herder, our thanks to Bob Black. But we do want to end the podcast with one last little item. This was a reminder to me from one of our faithful listeners, Lars Hansen, former Hornet offensive lineman and a regular at the Sac State games and a regular listener here, which we appreciate, that I think last year before the Causeway, I played the game tease, the last thing we play before we go on the radio to start the pregame show. So already have it ready for this week for Saturday's game. Thought I would throw this in as a little motivator maybe to end the podcast, get you fired up for the game. It's what we will play right before the broadcast on Saturday. So enjoy the tease, enjoy the week. We'll be back next week to recap and hopefully look forward to another round of playoff football. But either way, we'll be back next week for another edition of the Stingers Up Sacramento State Football Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and Stingers Up. All season long, the Sacramento State Hornets have been chasing an endless pursuit of targets. One by one, they've knocked them down. An undefeated non-league schedule that required an FBS win. A nationally televised game that produced a comeback for the ages.
O'Hara scored a rushing touchdown every game this season. He's going to keep the snap. He's going to run right. He's going to get in. Touchdown! Touchdown, Asher O'Hara. Touchdown, Hornets. It's a 1-point game.
The quest for a third consecutive Big Sky title, but to get there, a win over their rival was needed.
Aggies now can throw it to the end zone from here. Ball has been set. Clock is not running. Now it does. 10 seconds. 9 seconds. Hastings with the snaps. Got to air it to the end zone. Throws downfield. It's going to be caught. Rolling to the sideline. In the field of play. That's going to end the game. 2-1. The perfect season has happened. 11-0 for Sacramento State as they storm the field. They win the Big Sky Conference. They win it 27-21 over their rivals in a thrilling Causeway Classic.
Records, accolades, and national attention now front and center for the Sacramento State football program. All of it well-deserved, but there's one thing that has eluded them: postseason success. With dreams of 4 wins and a title, it starts with needing just one, getting that first FCS playoff win. The challenge is right in front of them. The talented Richmond Spiders visit California for the first time with their own dreams and aspirations. The FCS playoffs are here. It's win and move on, or lose and you're done. The Richmond Spiders, the Sacramento State Hornets. It's FCS playoff football, and it's next.